Hello and welcome back to the second part of this Week 4 lecture. And I'm going to continue our consideration of different mediation styles by considering two more, which I've mentioned already. The first being strategic mediation and the second being insight mediation. You may remember from last week that Kenneth Kressel defined strategic mediation as a subtype of the problem-solving mode. And in a 2007 article, Kressel explains the hallmark of this style is the mediator's attempt to address the underlying dysfunction or latent causes that are fueling the dispute. So the role of a mediator in strategic mediation is to search for and address the underlying conflict causes, which Kressel says differs from approaches about reaching settlement by facilitating a discussion around interests or through improving communication. And in this 2007 paper, he illustrates the use of the strategic style through a number of case-based illustrations. There's one about the mediation of conflicts amongst scientists by ombudspersons at the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland in the United States. And Kressel notes that here they refer to the strategic style as being deep problem solving. And Kressel defines strategic mediation process as having three, what he calls more or less discrete stages, in each of which the mediator is strongly directive. There's an initial diagnostic stage concerned with identifying latent causes, where the participants tell their story in response to focused and informed mediator questioning. There's then a strategy formulation stage, where there is explicit sharing with the parties of the mediator's thinking about the underlying causes, with a right for the parties to modify or even to reject the plan put forward by the mediator. And the mediator uses their knowledge of the conflict domain and the strategies which work in order to formulate the plan. And then finally, there is directive, what he calls orchestration by the mediator of the problem-solving plan. And Kressel goes on to say that although the strategic style is heavily dependent on establishing rapport, the approach is relatively unconstrained by concerns about neutrality. Its primary base of action is robust mediator self-confidence that in the domain at hand, the mediator is a comfortable and knowing expert. And he considers that the strategic style suggested by the case examined here, in which he means his paper, is based on a simpler, more pragmatic notion of problem solving. Conflict is often caused by real circumstances and events, and mediators, as repeat players in a given domain, are often in a position to help the parties identify those realities and to develop and implement a plan or strategy for addressing them. Insight mediation evolved within the context of interpersonal and workplace disputes. And like transformative mediation and narrative mediation, it's based on a relational view of the world, which sees individuals as connected to each other by cultures, traditions, religions, communities, and relationships. And insight mediation has drawn on the work of Bernard Lonergan, a Canadian Jesuit priest, who was interested in the structure of human knowing and who has at the core of his philosophy the invitation to pay attention to our acts of insight. Sargent et al. Consider that there are 5 core ideas which lie at the heart of the insight approach to mediation. And as set out on this slide, these are that conflict is relational, that conflict is dynamic and adaptive, that conflict emerges from meaning-making, that values are always operating within a conflict, and that communication involves interpretation as well as what he calls intention. And Sargent et al. Explain that the insight approach to mediation considers that conflict emerges when a person perceives that his or her cares or values are threatened and responds in a protective or defensive manner to this perceived threat. Essentially, this is the fight or flight response. and this response is interpreted by the other party as an attack, which results in the parties entering into escalating and conflict-prolonging attack-defend patterns. The role of insight mediators, Sargent says, is to help the parties interpret the situation through finding out whether each other's cares might necessarily be a threat, and by discovering whether their different cares can coexist without the need for threat. Insight mediators help the parties in a dispute to engage in conversations which reveal the dynamics of their cares and threats. Pickard and Joule describe this as deepening conversations, which involve the use of a complex set of listening and questioning skills that are generated from the mediator's insight into the threats to cares that the parties are experiencing. Deepening also produces new insights, revealing the deeper cares that give meaning to the events of the conflict. And in this way, the parties can explore what really matters. Pickard and Joule make the point that insight mediation is not a directive style, and it's not the mediator who leads the conversation. It's the parties who lead, with the mediator following and trying to understand their intents, interpretations, and responses. And they explain that the process of insight in mediation is similar to other mediation practices in that it engages parties in storytelling, exploring, and finding solutions to the conflict that can bring about change. And in insight mediation, these activities are separated into 5 what they call emergent stages. These are attend to process, broaden understanding, deepen insights, explore possibilities, and then make decisions. Pickard and Joule sum up the insight mediation approach in saying that deepening is a learning process by which the parties elaborate the meanings involved in a conflict. The mediator pays attention to the parties' operations of learning in the creation of the conflict. Everyone is engaged in a learning endeavour in the present. They experience the data unfolding, create meaning, gain insight, verify new understandings, and make new decisions as part of the overall mediation process. After hearing about insight and other relational mediation styles, you might be starting to wonder about the overlap between mediation and therapy. And in their 2003 paper on therapeutic divorce mediation, Smith and Maloney talk about the lively debate about this mediation therapy, a relationship, saying that this debate centres on the extent to which each process could and should overlap. In doing so, they draw on the work of Joan Kelly, who considered that despite some parallels in goals, techniques, and outcome, that mediation and therapy were actually very different. The arguments put forward by Smith and Maloney for this difference includes the dominant settlement focus of much of mediation, and that it tends also to be problem-solving. Its purpose is to produce quite often a tangible result, usually in the form of a written agreement, and that they say that mediation is a process which emphasises the present and the future, and not the past. Whereas Smith and Maloney consider that therapy tends to be more backward-looking in nature, and that most forms of therapy are exclusively focused on tangible results. Though the achievement of certain agreed-upon goals may be a legitimate part of therapy, therapeutic interventions frequently have broader goals, such as the achievement of healing, a greater sense of inner calm, and effective intra- and interpersonal functioning. You may want to pause the video just now and for a moment and reflect on whether or not you agree with these views about the difference between mediation and therapy. Turning now to other classifications of mediation style, in her 1997 paper called Identifying the Role of Social Norms in Mediation, a Multiple Model Approach, Professor Ellen Waldman considered the various approaches which had been used to classify mediation styles, saying that these analyses, while enormously helpful, leave unclear whether the differences in mediator orientation reflect distinct practice models or simply stylistic variations on a unified theme, and that more importantly, they classify mediator behaviour according to criteria which ignore or treat obliquely the role that social norms play in the process. So what are social norms? Well, the Changing Minds website defines these as being the rules that a group uses for appropriate and inappropriate values, beliefs, attitudes, and behaviours. These rules may be explicit or implicit. And in her paper, Waldman urges a reworking of mediation theory to enhance its descriptive and normative functions. And she produces a typology of mediation practice which ranks mediation models according to their treatment of social and legal norms. Waldman conceptualized mediation as a process comprising three separate models, and these are the norm generating, the norm educating, and the norm advocating models. And she also proposes that mediator styles can be placed on a continuum in terms of their approach to social and legal norms, and that each of these models may be profitably employed in different dispute contexts. Waldman's norm-generating model of mediation broadly corresponds to the facilitative approach to mediation, where legal norms tend not to apply, and where the mediator invites the parties to generate the social norms which will guide the resolution of their dispute. And Waldman says that the leitmotif of the norm-generating model, then, is its inattention to social norms. So essentially the approach in norm-generating mediation is that the mediator leaves it to the parties to decide on the basis on which to judge their outcome, with the parties referencing primarily their own values and standards. So the focus of the attention here is on interpersonal issues. In the norm-educating mediation model, the mediator educates the parties in relation to the relevant social and legal norms, but allows them to determine the degree to which these norms shape their resulting agreement. This model is based on the theory that people who are well-informed make better decisions, and that the parties can choose to ignore the mediator's normative guidance. And this model of mediation is often used in family mediation and also in commercial mediations, where the mediator often ensures that everyone understands the legal and business framework before decisions are made. And in the norm advocating model, for example, this is used in the mediation of disability rights. Waldman says that the mediator both educates and advocates for the inclusion of the relevant social and legal norms, insisting that any resulting agreements comply with these relevant legal, ethical, and professional rules. Susan Oberman considers that Waldman's framework allows us to compare models based on a number of categories, and these are theory of conflict, empowerment of the parties, the basis of the authority of the mediator, control of the process, and definition of success. And she says that this framework lays a foundation for an exploration of a variety of models, and it also provides a non-adversarial approach to defining them. And Oberman argues that in naming categories of mediation models as norm-generating, norm-educating, and norm-advocating, that Waldman grounds mediation theory in the parameters of the mediation itself. And in naming the three categories that address the situation and context of the mediation, she goes beyond a binary framework. And this construct provides the profession with a way to make sense of the issues and at the same time reinforces the self-determination of the parties. And Oberman says that Waldman's categories provide a way for the mediation profession to explain accurately and efficiently what participants can expect in any given mediation. Both process and substance decisions should be based on the parties and the attorneys and the mediator's influence regarding the norms being referenced. This furthers self-determination of the parties by giving the process transparency and defining process differences. If switching from one to another is desirable, the parties understand and consent at the point at which that decision is made. I now want to look at some research about what styles mediators actually use when they undertake mediations. We touched on the work of Cheryl Pickard in week 1, and in a 2004 paper, she's examined how mediators' understanding of their work varies with contextual factors such as their gender, educational background, dispute sector, and the length of time that they've been mediating. And Pickard also notes in her study how much of the research literature, particularly of the time, tended to portray mediation practice with the dualistic indicators, such as facilitative versus evaluative, or problem-solving versus transformative. Pickard discusses in her paper how it's overly simplistic to locate mediators as being in only one or another ideological camp, and she also discusses her finding that individual mediators draw on more than one single mediation theory to give meaning to their work. She calls for a move from pluralism to integration, advocating what she calls an integrative framework for understanding mediation, and saying that conceptualizing mediation as an integration of various theories and practices, rather than a single model approach, legitimates the broad range of mediation practices and practitioners. And returning to the keynote address of Dale Bradshaw, who we've considered in earlier weeks, Bradshaw has the view that this continual dichotomy between the styles has distracted mediators from examining more fundamental questions concerning mediations and other forms of alternative dispute resolution. And Bradshaw says that, I have argued that it's essential that mediators in the world today design models of mediation to fit the cultural, individual and collective needs of their clients, rather than forcing their clients to follow a particular model imposed by the mediator. In their 2009 article, Charkoudian et al., the article's called Mediation by Another Name Would Smell as Sweet, or Would It? Charkoudian et al. Described the outcome of a survey which looked at what mediators say they do, which were self-reported behaviours, and what they actually do, and that was when their behaviours were observed. And she found that the self-reported strategies found 4 distinct groups or clusters of mediator strategies, which she describes in the study as being clusters A, B, C, and D. And within each of these 4 clusters, the mediators surveyed did similar kinds of things to form a particular approach to mediation. So, for example, this slide shows that how the mediators in cluster A focused the most on reaching agreement and were the most likely to give direction on both the process and the outcome. Whereas the mediators, for example, in cluster D were at the opposite end of the spectrum, focusing on supporting the participants to control the outcome of the mediation. And what Charkoudian found in their study was that mediators self-defined labels relating to their mediation style, that she then correlated them with these 4 clusters and found little consistency between the labels that mediators gave their style and the cluster into which they actually fell in the survey. And in discussion in relation to these findings, Charkoudian et al. Consider that, as there is no accepted agreement as to the definition of mediation, or even the definition of approaches to mediation, that mediators should be prepared to describe in detail the process they offer and the types of strategies they employ during the process, as opposed to simply stating the name of a mediation style or approach. Going back to the work of Kressel, in Kressel et al. 2012, they've argued that mediator style is a seriously understudied topic, and they consider that the emphasis on this topic is well warranted for 4 different reasons. It's a useful guide to the management of the ambiguities of the mediation role. It's an important driver of mediation strategic and tactical behaviour. It's a guide to decision-making under conditions of what they call ambiguity and stress, and it's what disputants experience. It's not the textbook models of mediation. And in this 2012 study, 17 experienced and 5 novice mediators were asked to mediate the same angry roommates dispute involving a conflict between 2 college roommates. And the study found that the mediators described themselves as actually being stylistically eclectic, but this wasn't borne out by the observational data. And Kressel et al. Used multidimensional scaling to identify 2 dimensions underlying mediator performance: stylistic orientation, which was having a relational versus a settlement orientation, and the level of empathic attunement. And in their study, they report that qualitative analysis identified facilitative and evaluative variants of the settlement orientation, and also identified transformative and diagnostic variants of the relation orientation. And they found that facilitative and diagnostic mediators perform more skillfully than their evaluative and transformative counterparts. And Kressel et al. Noted that these preliminary findings suggest that mediator competence may be less a function of the mediator's style and more a function of the kinds of general or common qualities, referring to these qualities as being the mediator's energy, their warmth and optimism, their non-judgmental stance, and a willingness to adapt to the inclinations and needs of the parties. And in addition, they noted that mediators of either relational or settlement-oriented stance who had these qualities were judged more favourably by observers and disputants than those of either orientation who did not. And we'll look more detail at mediator qualities and what a mediator does in practice in topic 4. We'll also look in a bit more detail in later weeks about what success looks like in mediation for both the parties and the mediator. But for now, I'm going to take a brief look at some research relating to the effectiveness of these different mediation styles. However, I would stress that these selective findings can't be said to be definitive. Wall et al. In 2012 looked at 100 civil mediation cases and investigated the effectiveness of 3 mediator-observed styles. They looked at neutral, evaluative, and what they called pressing styles, and they looked at the effectiveness these on both agreement and satisfaction. And in this study, the authors did note that they looked for transformative strategies, but they found that they weren't there, concluding that the primary goal of the mediators that they studied was to achieve agreement. Their study found that the 2 assertive strategies, evaluative and pressing, produced significantly more agreements than a neutral strategy. And this assertiveness, along with its high agreement rate, produced only a modest reduction in disputant satisfaction. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the study also found that the subject of the dispute affected the settlement rate, with mediators obtaining more agreements in motor vehicle, medical malpractice and personal liability cases than they did in contract and employment disputes. And Wall et al. In this study noted that the most intriguing question spawned by their data was why the mediator's assertiveness did not substantially lower disputant satisfaction with the mediation process. And they speculated that there was only a modest reduction in satisfaction resulting from assertiveness, as the disputants appreciated that agreement had been reached, and that it was possible that the mediators developed such a strong rapport with the disputants that they weren't irked by the assertiveness. So in summary, Kressel says that despite the polemical tone that often characterizes discussions of problem solving and relational styles, there's no strong empirical evidence for preferring one approach over the other. In several correlation studies, disputing parties have been found to be more satisfied with the facilitative approach than a more evaluative one. However, in conflicts involving significant financial concerns, measures such as settlement rates and dollar amounts gained by the plaintiffs have favoured more aggressive and evaluative mediator behaviours. And Kressel goes on to observe that reported differences between styles are of considerable interest, but the number of studies is small, and the measures of stylistic differences are primarily of the self-report variety. And he also considers that mediation style is almost certainly a function of the context in which the mediation is occurring. And Kressel concludes that it's important to realise that mediator conscious identification with a stylistic orientation is unlikely to be the complete story behind how mediators behave. He says that a formal prescriptive model cannot possibly account for the unique elements of every conflict, and that in addition, the highly unpredictable and rapid interactions unfolding in front of the mediator require a blend of conscious deliberation and unconscious reflexive responding based on each mediator's unique beliefs, values, and experiences. Finally, in this topic, I'm going to leave you with what I think is a useful diagram from a paper by Ridley, Duff and Bennett, who produced this theoretical framework for understanding dispute resolution. These authors did have a focus on employment mediation, but in my view, their diagram provides a helpful summary of a number of the themes we've been considering so far, including some of the key characteristics of mediation and the relationship of mediation to other forms of dispute resolution. So I'm just going to pause for a minute just to let you have a look at this diagram. And you'll find the references for this part of the fourth lecture in a separate document on the Hub. And now you've completed this fourth lecture, you need to read the set readings for this week and also complete the associate exercise. Goodbye.